So if you find yourself led by a philosophical argument to contradict what you take to be the teaching of Scripture, I think what you do is you go back and ask yourself, is this something that Scripture really teaches?
Right.
Maybe I've misunderstood it. Maybe this is an assertion in Scripture, but it's not part of the teaching of Scripture.
And the final question is, and I'm very excited to ask this because I emailed Dr. Alexander Pruss and I said, Dr. Pruss, Dr. Craig is coming on the podcast, and this is the topic that we're going to talk about. Do you have a question for Dr. Craig? And he sent me one, and I was super surprised to see that from Dr.
Amazing.
Pruss. And so this question actually ties in, and he has put it very well. It need not be mentioned that Dr. Alexander Pruss put it very well. But so this ties in really well. And so here is the question from Dr. Alexander Pruss. He asks, suppose it looks to you that on purely textual grounds, including our knowledge of the textual context, the original languages, and the culture in which the inspired texts were written, the best reading of Scripture suggests that Scripture asserts a proposition P, and yet the best philosophical arguments lead to not P. How would you resolve that? Would you allow non-textual considerations, like philosophical ones, to supplement the textual ones when interpreting Scripture?
What Alex is asking about here, I think, is the doctrine of Scripture. Scripture has a doctrine of Scripture. And the principal and most important passage for the doctrine of Scripture is 2 Timothy 3:16, which says that all Scripture is inspired by God and profitable for teaching, for reproof, for correction, and for training in righteousness. Now, notice that it is the Scriptures that are inspired, not the authors of Scripture. The Scriptures are literally God-breathed, and therefore they are profitable for various purposes. And the four purposes that are mentioned can be classed as either pedagogical purposes or pastoral purposes. The two pedagogical purposes for which Scriptures are valuable is instruction in Christian doctrine, or in the Greek didaskalia, and for reproof, elengmos, which is the correction of false doctrine. So what the Scriptures are valuable for is for Christian teaching with respect to doctrine and ethics. And so it's not the case that everything that Scripture asserts is true. What is the case is that everything that Scripture teaches about doctrine and morals is true. And so if you run into statements that seem to you to be falsehoods that are found in Scripture, I think evangelical interpreters would tend to deny that those are part of the teaching of Scripture. It's important to understand here that the teaching of Scripture is not identical to the assertions of Scripture. And I think a real acid test for any tenable doctrine of inspiration is the imprecatory Psalms, where the psalmist prays these horrible things to happen to those who are his enemies, including dashing the skulls of their babies against the rocks. On the position I would defend, I would say that this prayer, despite its vengeful and ugly sentiments, is not contrary to divine inspiration, because divine inspiration doesn't imply a kind of dictation theory. Rather, I would understand this prayer to be appropriated speech. It is a prayer which God knew that the outraged psalmist would offer in his anguish, and then God appropriates this prayer as his word to us, much in the way that a boss might appropriate a letter written by his secretary by appending his signature to that letter, thereby making it his own words. So why would God include such a horrid prayer in the scripture, which is contrary to good ethical thinking? What does he intend to teach by these imprecatory psalms? Well, I think it could be that he's trying to teach us the importance of being honest with God, of coming to him just as we are, with no pretense of piety, expressing honestly the depth of our anger or disappointment with God or doubts about God, as the psalmist often do. These and other psalms are meant to teach us that God receives us just as we are and are open to our prayers. So inerrancy attaches to what the scripture teaches, not just what the scripture says or asserts. Only what the scripture teaches is guaranteed to be true. So if you find yourself led by a philosophical argument to contradict what you take to be the teaching of scripture, I think what you do is you go back and ask yourself, is this something that scripture really teaches?
Right.
Maybe I've misunderstood it. Maybe this is an assertion in scripture, but it's not part of the teaching of scripture. On the other hand, as I indicated earlier in this interview, it may be that when you go back and look at your philosophical argument, you find an error in your reasoning, and that in fact, good philosophical reasoning is not contradictory to the teaching of scripture. So the answer to Alex's question in short is yes, there is a symbiotic relationship here between scripture and philosophical argument, in that philosophical argument can help us to discern what is the teaching of scripture, and the teaching of scripture can help us to call into question at times what our philosophical arguments may lead us to conclude.